Well, good morning. The music has started, and that is the sign that we are getting rolling with the Footlight broadcast here. Thanks for your time and attention. Welcome. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the broadcast, my name is Brian O'Kelly. This is a Bible teaching show. I am a Bible teacher. It is on Sunday morning because that's when it works for me, not because there's anything magic about Sunday. And also, I want to make sure I reiterate, because some people have messaged me this way, this is not a substitute for church. You do need to get together with other Christians. I wanted to just ask at the outset, anyone who's a regular viewer / listener, especially I know most of the audience is on the audio podcast, which you can get wherever you get your podcasts. But please do hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the share button. That's awesome. If you want to support what I do here, go visit the website at thefootlight.com. I will say it does cost about $200 a month to do, and it would be awesome if there was that much coming in. And lately it's been $15, $20 coming in every month. So it would be cool if I could make it where I didn't fund it, but if not, no big deal. I will continue marching on. I'm not in it for the money, and any money that came in would go into promotion anyway. So enough with the housekeeping stuff. We have been in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew for quite a long time now. Weeks and weeks and weeks, as we are getting into the last today of the Beatitudes. Chapter 5 of Matthew opens with this series of statements of Jesus, what's called the Sermon on the Mount, and a series of statements about how to live, how to evaluate life decisions. And in each of these, Jesus offers this category of people who are blessed, as well as the reason they're blessed. And today we will get into the last of the Beatitudes. This one is, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, this kind of marks a shift from the preceding Beatitudes. Okay, and the shift is that the other ones are about things that you do. This is about something that happens to you because of something you do. So what Jesus speaks about here is the opposition faced by those who are committed to righteousness. So it's not just any persecution of anyone. The idea here that, blessed are the persecuted, that it's any kind of persecution of anyone, anywhere. It's those who are persecuted because of a commitment to following God, a commitment to the gospel today, a commitment to Jesus and to Christianity. And Jesus is directly addressing the struggles and the persecution that his disciples at the time and his followers later could expect due to their commitment to Christianity, due to a commitment to the gospel. And so it's important to understand Christians are persecuted around the world today for their faith. This is nothing new. It's been going on since the beginning of the church. An outfit called Open Doors, which kind of tracks this persecution, says that 1 in 7 Christians are persecuted worldwide. 1 in 5, 20% in Africa. 2 in 5, 40% in Asia. Last year in 2003, 2023 estimates, 4,998 Christians were murdered for their faith. 4,125 were jailed for their faith, and there were almost 14,766 churches or other Christian properties that were attacked. So persecution of Christians is a real thing. Now, there are several types of persecution of Christians. There is the communist or post-communist atheism persecution of Christians. China, North Korea, Laos, Cuba. There is the Islamic oppression type of persecution of Christians. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Pakistan, much of the Islamic world persecutes people for following Jesus. There are paranoid dictators who persecute Christians because they can't have loyalty to anything but themselves. Tajikistan is one of these, Nicaragua, there are a number around the world. There's religious nationalism. In India, it's Hinduism. In Myanmar, it's Buddhism, where they have an official national religion, and Christianity is seen as a threat to that. There's also Christian denominationalism, places where the denominations is dominant, and other types of Christianity are not allowed. So Ethiopia, where the Eastern Orthodox Church is dominant, if you're not an Eastern Orthodox Christian or you leave the Eastern Orthodox Church, you will more likely than not be persecuted for that. And then there's the organized crime type of persecution. Colombia, Mexico, many places where people are loyal to Jesus and won't succumb to the criminals, they're persecuted for that. And we're seeing some of the beginnings of that in the West now, right? We're seeing children ripped from families over the fact that they won't support their kids' transgender ideology, right? There are physicians and pharmacists who have their careers and licenses threatened over abortion or trans care. There are people in government. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson was pretty well criticized for his faith immediately after becoming the speaker. And famously, the woman in Kentucky who wouldn't give marriage licenses to homosexual couples. And so and many people are ostracized or ridiculed in their employment or other situations because of their Christianity. Now, this is nothing at all like the persecution that people are experiencing in those other parts of the world, but it is the beginning of the ostracization, putting Christians on the outs here in the West. Now, this beatitude about persecution kind of aligns with this broader biblical narrative that foretells of the suffering of the righteous and their eventual vindication, right? The promise that theirs is the kingdom of heaven speaks to this ultimate reward that awaits those who endure persecution for righteousness. And it points towards a time when God's kingdom will be fully realized. The Beatitude provides hope and assurance to anyone facing persecution, assuring them that their faithfulness to righteousness is not wasted, it's not in vain. It challenges believers to examine their commitment to godly living, right? And to be prepared for some of the inevitable challenges that may arise in standing for justice and truth. Many people, especially people in construction and the trades and those kind of things, work in an environment where there are a lot of what would be called dirty jokes, right? Or crass humor, or a lot of people who are go out drinking and all these kind of things. And the Christians often are the ones who are standing there not laughing at those jokes and not going out. One of my oldest friends, Van, was a longshoreman, and Van told me that as a longshoreman, of course, this is an environment where there's a lot of crudity, right? A lot of the union guys, there's a lot of foul language and a lot of going out drinking and that kind of stuff. And they knew what a Christian was supposed to be. And so Van would often be challenged by them. Well, yeah, you're not gonna go with us. You're a Christian. You're not gonna think this is funny. You're a Christian. And this is kind of the way it should be. And you should be prepared for criticism and perhaps even hardship as a result of Christianity. And the Beatitude also here, it invites us as believers to consider the cost of discipleship, right? And be prepared for opposition. Now, how does this all work? Well, first of all, there is a war against the saints. We have to recognize that we are in a conflict and we are the subject of conflict. There is satanic hostility. If you look at Revelation chapter 12, verses 10 to 12, it says, "Then I heard a loud voice sing in heaven, now salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows he has a short time." It's important for us to recognize that we are in a war. Also, God has told us that the kingdom will be given to those who suffer for it. Daniel 7:21-22 says, "I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints, and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom." So, watching the horn, or watching, being faithful to God and relying on the Ancient of Days means that we will possess the kingdom. When you look at Acts 14:22, it says, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must through many tribulations enter the kingdom of God. How do we enter the kingdom of God? By being faithful to the King and enduring whatever comes as a result. Now, we see some examples of this in the Old Testament. We see Joseph, of course, who was imprisoned for his faithfulness by not going with the wife of Potiphar, persecuted in Egypt and ultimately was vindicated. We see Daniel, who was persecuted and ultimately became the king. David ultimately became the king. Daniel was persecuted because he wouldn't follow the ways of Nebuchadnezzar, right? The Messiah, of course, Jesus, was persecuted. We see this in Isaiah 53:3. It says, he's despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. As we hid as it were our faces from him, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Isaiah 53:7-8 says, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. And he was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was stricken. So Jesus was persecuted, and of course, Jesus inherits the world, inherits the kingdom, right? Isaiah 53:12 says, therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. It was the persecution of Jesus that led to the possession of the kingdom by Jesus. Luke 24:25-26, Jesus said this. It says, then he said to them, O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe in all the prophets had spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? It is suffering for the gospel that allows us to enter into the kingdom. Now, why is the world so hostile towards those who have escaped from it? Why is the world so hostile to those who are Christians? Well, John 15:19 says, if you were of the world will love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Christians are called to uphold righteousness, even when it leads to the world hating us, even when it leads to opposition and persecution. Now, why does the world react this way? Well, first of all, there's human rebellion against God and against his anointed, right? Psalms 2:1-3 says, why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. Cast away their cords. What they want is to be free from the constraints of the gospel, from the constraints of a righteous life. They want to cast away those bonds. They want to be wise in their own eyes. Matthew 5:11 says, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my name's sake. Humans rebel against God. They rebel against Jesus. Blessed are you when you're persecuted for his name's sake. Now, there's also strong resentment against righteousness. Okay, when you're righteous and others aren't, they will resent you for it. And in 1 John 3, verse 11-13, it says, for this message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not marvel, my brethren, if the world hates you. In other words, if you are as able and, being righteous, obeying God, the world who doesn't obey God will hate you for it. 1 Peter 4:1-4 says, therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust of the Gentile, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. If you don't do what they do, if you don't go out and drink and party and cheat on your wife and tell dirty jokes and do all the things that God hates, they will speak evil of you. Now, there is persecution sometimes when you've done the wrong thing. There's no blessing for being persecuted for bad behavior. So it's not just any old persecution. It's persecution for righteousness, right? 1 Peter 4:15-16 says this, "But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." So if you're suffering because of righteousness, because of your Christianity, glorify God. But if you're suffering because of your misdeeds, then you've got that coming. 1 Peter 2:19-20 says, "For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if you are beaten for your faults and you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God." So in other words, if you're patient and enduring when you've done the wrong thing and you get a speeding ticket, just as a minor example, and you say, well, yeah, I was speeding, and go pay your fine, this is not a commendable thing. What's commendable is when you get the speeding ticket and you didn't speed and you go and pay the fine. That's a totally different thing. When you are taking an unjust punishment patiently, this is commendable. Now, what is the Christian's proper response to persecution? What is the right thing to do when we're being persecuted? Let me grab a drink of coffee here. It's funny, before the broadcast, I made this cup of coffee, and I got busy setting a couple things up, and right as the show intro was going, I was like, where's that coffee? And I had to run over and grab it. Anyway, and now it's not as warm as I'd like. But anyway, that's a little aside. So the Christian's proper response to persecution. Well, number one, flight is permitted. Matthew 10:23 says, "When they persecute you in this city, flee to another." Acts 9:23-25 says, "Now after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him." This is Paul, right? "But their plot became known to Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket." So there's nothing wrong with getting away from persecution. You're not commanded somehow to stand and fight. But what is not permitted, as near as I can tell, is forcible resistance. Matthew 5:39 says, "But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." James 5:6 says, "You have condemned, you have murdered the just, he does not resist you." In other words, when we are being persecuted unjustly, we are not to forcibly resist. We're to take it. We are to suffer as Christ. When we suffer as Christ does, we are of the same mind of Christ, and we are inheriting the kingdom in the same way. We also, as a proper response, need to remember Jesus. Hebrews 12:1-4 says, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become wearied and discouraged in your souls. You have not yet resisted a bloodshed, striving against sin." When we are being persecuted, we are supposed to look at it the same as Jesus did. Okay? That for the joy set before us, we endure the persecution. We endure it. Lest we become weary, we have to remember Jesus, and he is who we want to be like. We are to rejoice when we're persecuted. Matthew 5:12 again says, "Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." We are to rejoice when we experience persecution. We are also to rejoice because their hostility can be taken as a compliment. Acts 5:41 says, "So they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name." We also are to rejoice because we're given an opportunity to glorify God in this, right? 1 Peter 4:13-14 says, "But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified." God is glorified when we endure persecution. When we're persecuted, one of the other responses we're supposed to have is we're supposed to bless the persecutors. We're supposed to do good for them. We're supposed to pray for them. Later in this chapter that we're studying, Matthew 5, verse 44, Jesus says this, "But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." This is what we as Christians are supposed to do. Romans 12:17-21, Paul tells the church in Rome this, "Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." We are supposed to bless our enemies. Now, we're also supposed to pray for the ultimate vindication of God's people. Revelation chapter 6, verses 9-11 says, "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, 'How long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?' Then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were was completed." The ultimate end of the story is the vindication of the persecuted, the vindication of those who believe. One other response we should have to persecution is we should increase our own resolve to press on into the kingdom. Matthew 11:12 says, "And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force." The kingdom suffers violence. This is nothing, to be surprised about. And there can't be a kingdom without people in the kingdom. If everybody who's persecuted leaves the kingdom, if we leave the Lord, then the other side wins, right? And we know that the kingdom wins. We are to press into the kingdom. Acts 14 verses 2 and 3 says, "But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brethren. Therefore they stayed there a long time, speaking boldly in the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands." So when the Jews stirred people up, the disciples leaned in. They had the opposite response of they didn't run away, they leaned in. And again, flight is permissible, but abandoning the mission of Jesus is not. Acts later in the same chapter 14, 19-20 says, Then the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city. And the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So here they beat the crap out of him and left him outside the city. And what did Paul do? Did he run away? He got up and went back into the city. When we're persecuted, we should increase our own resolve to press on into the kingdom. So, with that, that is the exposition, I guess, of the 8th Beatitude, the last. And in summary, I'd just like to say this. When we are persecuted for our faith in the workplace, in social circles, by the government, we need to lean into it. This is, we need to not be surprised by it. We need to rejoice in it. This is how we will inherit and become the possessors of the kingdom of heaven. If you found this valuable, again, please hit the like, subscribe, share buttons, whatever platform you're on, Rumble, Getter, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and of course the audio podcast available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you can find a way to visit the website at thefootlight.com, all the show notes are up there, as are ways to support the broadcast. Thanks again, and Lord willing, see you next week with the